Welcome to Marking the End Times on this 248th anniversary of the birth of our great nation that God has given to us. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that story that told of Benjamin Franklin when he walked out at one point from the Constitutional Convention. A woman named Elizabeth Powell asked him the question. She said, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And Benjamin Franklin responded, "A republic if you can keep it." And God has graciously strengthened and sustained our great republic now for 248 years. And we need to thank God for that today. Here we are on July the 4th, 2024. We need to thank God for all these years for his gracious hand upon our nation. But as we look back on America's past and we look at what's happening in our country today, I think that we can't help but ask ourselves the question, what about America's future? Where's America headed? Is America mentioned in Bible prophecy? Are there any clues about America's future? I want to talk about that today in light of some recent things that are happening here in our country. It's a question that maybe is the most asked question we get here at endtimes.com. And really, as I've gone and spoken at prophecy conferences and other places, people want to know about America's place in Bible prophecy in the end times. And so I want to talk about that today on this 248th anniversary of our great republic. Before we do that, I want to mention some questions that we'll answer a bit later in the subscriber-only section. One question is, in light of these last days, what does it mean in Isaiah 13:13, where it says the earth will be shaken out of her place? Another question is, the questioner says, the leader of our men's Bible study doesn't believe the Bible teaches a pre-trib rapture. Are there any verses that prove the timing of the rapture, or is it just what many of us would wish would happen? Another question, I've lost track of the kings in Bible prophecy. Where does this group that calls themselves BRICS nations fit into the lineup of nations during the end times? And then a final question, is the book of life mentioned twice in Revelation 20, the same as the Lamb's book of life in Revelation 21:27? So in a bit, we'll go to the subscriber-only section and we'll answer those questions. But today I want to talk about America in Bible prophecy. Our country today is on all of our minds. A lot of things happening in our nation right now that are disquieting, they're disconcerting, maybe even very discouraging and depressing to many of us. We see increasing lawlessness in our nation. We see a widening political divide, really that seems in many ways an unbridgeable gulf, really, and divide in our nation. And so, people are wondering, what is the future of America? Now, we've talked about this before, but let me just kind of remind you of what my view is. I don't think America is mentioned directly in the Bible. Clearly, you don't have the words America or United States mentioned anywhere in Scripture. Others will say, well, I think maybe America's found in some indirect way or kind of some symbolic passage. Some will find America as Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18. Some have thought that America is that unnamed nation in Isaiah 18. Some believe that America is the 10 lost tribes of Israel. I just received a note. I get a lot of emails with people sending me about different views they have, that Daniel chapter 8 and verse 23 is a reference to America in prophecy. So there are many candidates out there and different passages in Bible prophecy people try to use to find America. Another one is in Ezekiel 38, that America is the young lions of Tarshish. I don't think any of those are a reference to the United States. So my view would be that America is not mentioned either directly or indirectly in Bible prophecy. So that leaves us with the question, well, what's going to happen to America? I think that signals to me that something dramatic is going to happen to America in the future. The reason I say that is if we're the great power that we are today, you would assume that we'd be mentioned somewhere in Bible prophecy. Now, people will say, well, in the Bible, though it mainly mentions nations around Israel, well, it mentions the kings of the east that come from far east of the Euphrates. It mentions Rosh and Magog, nations very far from the nation of Israel. So God could have easily given some kind of statement in Scripture where it would be easy to identify that America is being talked about in prophecy. So I think it means America is going to have to be reduced as a nation in the future. We won't be the great power that we are today. So then that raises the question, well, what's going to happen to America? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but there are a lot of plausible scenarios for what could account for the reduction of the United States. I mean, one is the debt explosion that we see in our country. That we could experience an economic implosion, what some call economic Armageddon. Just think about this. Some articles just came out this week. The federal IOU, that's our federal debt. So the IOU that we have is now at $34.5 trillion. It's $11 trillion higher than it was in March of 2020. So we've added $11 trillion, or it's increased by almost half, or I guess about 50%, just in 4 years. The Fed chief, Jerome Powell, said this just yesterday. He expressed concerns about a large deficit being run at a full time of full employment. So he was saying that, if employment was not full, you could see us having these debts, but we have low unemployment. He says the level of debt we have is not unsustainable, but the path that we're on is unsustainable. It's an unsustainable trajectory that we're on. We just crossed recently $1 trillion in consumer debt in America. So literally our citizens in many ways are drowning in debt. CNN has an article just this week, just a couple days ago. The world is sitting on a $91 trillion problem. Hard choices are coming. So global debt now is $320 trillion, $320 trillion. And I think this will play a large part in that third horse of the apocalypse during the tribulation period, that black horse, where there's going to be runaway inflation and widespread starvation in our world. With this kind of debt that the world is mounting, there's 100 nations right now that are going to have to make drastic changes in the near future. I mean, this is being called right now the decade of debt. And eventually, this is all going to have to be resolved at some point in the future, and it's going to be dramatic when it takes place. But this article in CNN says governments owe an unprecedented $91 trillion. So the global debt's $320 trillion, but governments owe about $91 trillion, an amount almost equal to the size of the global economy, one that will ultimately exact a heavy toll on their populations. This has to be urgently addressed in the United States, they're saying. They're saying higher debt servicing costs means less money available for public services, responding to crises like financial meltdowns, pandemics, or wars. The more money you spend and pay to service debt, the less money you have to fund your military. In the United States, the federal government will spend $892 billion in this year on interest payments, more than is earmarked for defense, more than is earmarked for national defense, paying out in debt. It's approaching the budget for Medicare, health insurance, and those with disabilities. Next year, interest payments will top $1 trillion for the first time on national debt of this $35 trillion that we now have. It's roughly equal to the size of the U.S. economy. The CBO sees U.S. debt reaching 122% of gross domestic product in 10 years. And in 2054, if we don't slow down, debt is forecast to be 165% of gross domestic product, or about $56 trillion. So all this debt that's piling up in our country is going to have to be dealt with. And the problem is no politicians want to deal with it on their during their terms, because it's going to require a lot of hard choices, a lot of austerity. It's probably going to mean a shrinking in our economy. So the can just keeps getting kicked down the road. And think about this someday when the rapture of the church takes place. Think about all this debt, and suddenly you have 20, 30 million people, however many believers there are in America, suddenly taken out of this country. When you talk about a drop on the Dow Jones the next day, you talk about a financial and a housing crisis and a crash and a total destruction of the Dow Jones and the stock market. So think about our country and how quickly, just because of all this debt that's mounting, our country could be reduced. Another thing, and again, I don't enjoy talking about this at all. I pray for our country every day. I pray for politicians I don't like. In fact, I may pray for the politicians I don't like more than the ones I do like, because I in my sense is they need it even more. This isn't enjoyable to talk about, but God is lining things up for the future that he has planned for this world. And it would seem that America is not a major part of that. Now, another thing is the terror threat. I'm seeing in this last week, several U.S. military bases in Europe are on heightened alert amid possible terrorist threat. CBS News, U.S. military heightens security alert level at European bases in response to threats. The Heritage Foundation, America's alarmingly high terror threat just keeps climbing the more we fling open our doors. Talking about at the southern border. The CIA Deputy Director Mike Morrell says the terror threat posed by vulnerabilities at the U.S.-Mexico border is blinking red. And the alarm bells are going off all over the place. It's an all-time high. Over 1,500 people from Tajikistan illegally crossed our border between October 2020 and May 2024. 500 have been caught this year alone. Recently, 8 Tajiks were caught who had known ties to ISIS. So think about what about those with unknown ties? And most of them have been released. Terror cells in the U.S. can wreak havoc. The psychological effect on our country would be devastating, and it would further, I think, help further crater the U.S. economy. One other thought is just, the nuclear threat. We hear a lot about climate change today being an existential threat. President Trump just this week said that he believes the existential threat to our world is not as much climate change as it's the nuclear threat. Iran is a threshold nuclear nation. North Korea has nuclear weapons and the missile systems to deliver them. And then Russia has more nuclear weapons than any nation in the world. They're saying just this week, Russia's saying that they might reduce the decision-making time stipulated for the use of nuclear weapons if they believe that's needed. The war in Ukraine, an article says, has triggered the biggest confrontation between Russia and the West since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, with President Vladimir Putin saying Russia might change its official nuclear doctrine, setting out the conditions under which such weapons could be used. So think about all these things that are happening and think about how these things could converge in a fatal combination. Okay, we see the lawlessness in our country today. We see all the political turmoil in our country. We see the debt implosion that's definitely coming at some point in time. We see the terror threat. We see this nuclear threat. Again, all these things could combine in a fatal combination. And you add the rapture of the church in there with all of these things that are happening today. We see how America could become a second, third-rate nation overnight. Now, we need to remember when I say all of this that God is in control of the nations. God controls our lives, and God controls the nations. God sits above the vault of the earth. He sits on his throne in heaven, and he controls what's happening. So God is in control of our nation, but God is preparing this world for the home stretch of this church age that will ultimately lead into the tribulation period. So we have to see what's happening in our nation today as part of God's plan. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't do all we can for our nation. We're told to pray, and we need to be praying for our country. I pray for our nation every day. We need to continue as a nation to support Israel. The statements back in Genesis 12 are still in effect. Those who bless Israel, God will bless. The one who curses Israel, God will curse. So as we support Israel, it will keep God's hand of blessing upon our nation in spite of all of our other problems. You need to support your local church, a Bible-teaching, Bible-believing church. The church is the glue that holds our country together. Remember when Alexis de Tocqueville came here long ago to our country? He went back and he said that the greatness and the genius of America was pulpits aflame with righteousness. That was the greatness and the genius of this country. So we need to be supporting churches and local ministries that are have pulpits that are aflame with righteousness. And we need to live a godly life. Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Well, if we want our nation to be blessed by God, we need to live righteous lives. We can't talk about how bad everything is out there in our world and be living a life that's unrighteous and ungodly ourselves if we want God's hand of blessing to be upon our nation. So today, as I'm celebrating this 248th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I love our country. I'm praying for God's hand of blessing to be upon it. I'm praying for the upcoming elections. I'm trying to live a godly life. I'm trying to see what I can do at our church, the church I pastor, to see that the pulpit there is aflame with righteousness, to support the nation of Israel. But as we look at our world today, we look at our country, we do see America in dire straits. And I think a lot of these different scenarios we see today could lead to the demise, the reduction of our country. And again, I think the ultimate thing will be the rapture of the church when all the salt and light is suddenly taken out of this country. in a moment of time, in the time it takes to blink your eye. I think that's going to be the end of our country, and America may find itself in one of these other alliances of nations that we see developing today, maybe even coming under the umbrella ultimately of the final Antichrist. Well, we're going to go now to the subscriber-only section, answer these questions that we mentioned earlier. If you're not a subscriber, you'd like to be, you can go to endtimes.com and you can sign up there. And I think you'll find a lot of information that will be of great benefit to you in your Christian life. So let's go to the subscriber-only section now and answer these questions.